Cool. So before we get going today, I'd just like to draw your attention to this slide, which is just letting you know that we seek to share information to build understanding across the not-for-profit sector in remote, rural and regional communities. However, we do not and are not able to provide legal or financial advice. So the information that we convey in this webinar today is intended to be general information only, and you should not rely on it as the sole source of information for your decision making. So now that we have that out of the way, welcome to this, the second in our new Know and the How webinar series. So this is a new series of monthly webinars designed around topics that we get a lot of questions about here at FRRR. We held our first webinar back in November last year, and in that webinar we gave an overview of the Rebuilding Regional Communities program, which is a relatively new program. It was introduced last year. And today we're going to just dive a bit deeper into some of the issues that were brought up in that webinar. So, and of course, if you want more information on the Rebuilding Regional Communities program, you can jump onto our YouTube page and see our last session. So just a bit of an overview slide here. So we'll just have a quick look at what we're doing today, why we're doing it, and where you can find more information. So today we will cover a bit of a recap of the Rebuilding Region. We'll look at how responses to the pandemic directly impacted on or magnified existing pressures on regional Australia. Then we'll look to delineate the different impacts on communities versus community organisations from the pandemic. And then we'll look at how these impacts relate to the Rebuilding Regional Communities program and its objectives. So, why are we doing this? So there's a few reasons. First one being that the Rebuilding Regional Communities funding application form requires you to address the impacts of COVID-19 and to align it to our program objectives. So we just want to give you a bit more help to get that right. And what we have been seeing is that many of our applications are not addressing how COVID-19 impacts, and that's despite the program being consistently oversubscribed. And quite often, even when COVID-19 is addressed, it's a real sort of tack on at the end rather than being integrated into the proposal. So we really just want to help you guys to try and strengthen those applications, because we see many, many great concepts, but they're just not tying to COVID that well. And the final reason is that during outreach, the team have had many conversations with community organisations outside of those heavily locked down areas, so particularly outside of Victoria, where the organisations don't really think they're eligible to apply because they weren't getting constantly locked down or something like that, so they don't think that they've had the impacts necessary for this program, and that's just not the case. And finally, where to find out more. So we'll cover more in terms of contacts and resources at the end of this session. But just for now, I wanted to draw your attention to a new resource, which is called Exploring COVID-19 Impacts. So this resource can be downloaded from our website in the form of a COVID impacts flyer. So that's on the Rebuilding page on the FRRR website. And you guys will also all be emailed a copy of it since you registered for today's session. So the material we're covering today is drawn from that resource. So you'll be able to refer back to the resource for this webinar if you want to remind yourself of what we've talked about. So diving into it, as I said, we'll do a quick recap of the Rebuilding Regional Communities program. So this is a 2.5-year program funded by the Australian government, and its purpose is to give regional communities the opportunity to access funds to support projects aimed at helping communities and organisations recover from the pandemic. So there are 3 objectives to the RRC program, and you'll see I've got them bolded there on that slide, and that's because they need to be addressed in your applications, and that's part of this whole webinar where I'm going to try and tie that all back together. So as I said, there are 3 objectives. The first one is to enhance the process of recovery of remote, rural and regional communities from the pandemic. Second is to reduce social isolation and foster stronger, more resilient remote, rural and regional communities. And the third is to sustain local, remote, rural and regional organisations and their work. And those three objectives, when you're looking at your application, your project might address one of them, or it might address two, or it might address all three. That doesn't matter so much as long as you're aligning to one of them. So the program has two funding tiers. We've got micro grants for up to $10,000, and these are always open and they're assessed 4 times per year, which is in line with our Strengthening Rural Communities program cut-off dates, because we're a stream of that program. We also offer larger grants of between 10 and 50,000, and they're part of a 2-stage process, and I believe there's 2 more rounds in 2022, which you'll be able to apply to for up to 50,000 in funding. And I think the next round is opening on the 1st or 2nd of March, where you will have that opportunity. So RRC is available, or Rebuilding Regional Communities, I should say, is available nationwide, as long as the project community meets our criteria on population size and remoteness. And these criteria do differ depending on the funding tier that you're applying to. So the guidelines have much more detail about that, or I'm happy to answer questions on that after. We support a broad range of projects. We've supported projects from infrastructure, mental health programs, volunteer engagement programs, festivals, events, lots and lots of different things. And we offer very personalised support. So I'm your one-stop shop for all support RRC related. So if you've got any questions, any concerns, you want help getting your proposal together, or if for whatever reason you're not successful and you want feedback after the case, I'm more than happy to talk you through that as well. So in terms of applying, you do that via Grants Gateway, and there's a link to that on our webpage, where you'll also find our guidelines, information on deadlines, everything you should need, and contact details as well. And in terms of putting a strong application together to this program, we've got a series of tips. You'll see the top one again is bolded, and that's addressing COVID-19. So again, I've bolded that because that is the topic we are discussing today. So in saying that, you need to address what the impact has been on your community or organisation, and how your project is going to help to address that impact, or to help you or your cover. And you need to link to at least one of the 3 RRC program objectives that I went through before. And those objectives are spelled out on our website and our guidelines in the COVID resource, so you don't need to try and remember them right now. These tips I went through in the previous webinar, and a lot of them will be the subject of future webinars as well, so I'm not going to go into them in a great deal of detail today, just a quick broad brush. But so we've got project planning, so making sure you've thought it all through, basically. So that's the rationale, the scope of the project, personnel and budget. And despite you needing to provide less information when you're doing the large grant expressions of interest, which is the first stage of the 2-stage process that I talked about, I think it's particularly important for those projects to have thought these things through, because you need to be very succinct and still sell your idea to us. So project planning is super important. To demonstrate broad community benefit. So the best projects will have an impact beyond a small group, and projects should be open to all who will benefit. So that's not to say that we won't fund projects that have a relatively small pool of beneficiaries, but you'll be up against it if there are other projects that support a larger portion of the population. So always go for the broadest community. In terms of your budget, so that's making sure it's detailed and it's realistic, and it's best if you can show the full project costs, even where you're only asking for a small portion of those costs from FRRR. So you would also in that case be showing your other sources of funding, and also potentially where you've got the value in kind contributions to your project. So that, for example, could be volunteer labour. Make sure you have the necessary permissions for your project. So, for example, if you are updating a building or the lands around a building and you're not the building owner, then we're going to want to know that you've got the owner's permission to do it. Could also be the case where you're doing building work and you need council approval, then we'd want to know that that is definitely on track as well. And provide strong letters of support. So that's really helping to show that all community benefit, and it's also a good opportunity to show that you've got those necessary permissions as well. But for the rest of the session today, we're going to be focusing on that first point, which is addressing COVID-19. Defining impacted by COVID-19 and how do we do it? So I think the first point we have here is that there's not a one size fits all criteria. So the pandemic has impacted on regional communities across Australia in loads of ways, and no one has been unaffected. So in this session, we will talk about what we have learned so far, but our knowledge is not complete and the information here is not exhaustive. So if we don't talk about impacts that your community or not-for-profit has experienced, it doesn't mean we discount it or we won't fund projects related to it. It just means that we don't know about it yet. So please do be in touch and talk it through. We'll chuck that application and see what happens. So when we think about what impacted by COVID-19 means, we see three overarching themes that have come through quite clearly. One is that COVID-19 accelerated or magnified existing issues or trends. The second is that policy responses to COVID-19 had very direct impacts on regional communities and organisations. And that impacts manifested quite differently for communities versus the community organisations that support them. So in terms of that second dot point there, which is existing trends and issues, a number of trends or issues were at play for regional Australia pre-pandemic. The direct responses to the pandemic that we'll talk about next interacted with those trends or issues to apply added pressure to regional communities. And three issues or trends have particularly come through in the applications that we've received to date. I'm sure there were more, but these ones have really stood out for us. The first one is ongoing natural disasters, which have been causing cumulative stress in communities, and the pandemic really magnified those pressures for regional Australia. The digital divide between metro and regional Australia, so work, education, socialisation, the running of community organisations, were all hindered by inadequate internet access across much of regional Australia during the pandemic. So the pandemic really magnified that existing issue within the regions. And existing inequities in access to essential health, transport and social services for rural and regional communities, particularly with the regional migration that occurred during the sort of 20 to 22 sort of period, placing extra pressure on often scant regional infrastructure. So we have these existing trends or stresses on regional communities already, and then along came COVID and the responses to it really added to or magnified those existing issues. So some of those direct responses that we're looking at here primarily be policy response space. So examples would be lockdowns, whether they were national, statewide or localised. And Victoria particularly, and also New South Wales, were hit hardest with a lot of social and economic impacts flowing on from those lockdowns. Border closures were another policy response that had a big impact, particularly for border communities. You know, when you can't get to work or your kids can't get to school or you can't see your mum who's just over the border, that really causes a lot of social and economic pressure. Tourist towns were severely impacted, as were other regional areas that rely on migrant workers, whether, for example, they're agricultural or service workers. And a lot of those areas are still suffering from that reduction in movement with downstream economic and social impacts. And finally, restrictions, whether that was on visitors, for example, to healthcare settings or patron numbers in bars and restaurants, also had big economic and social impacts across regional Australia. So these responses cut off regional Australians from their normal networks and connections, creating social and economic isolation. Hence, we say everyone was affected. So whatever community you're in or whatever not-for-profit you work for, chances are, if you've got a project responding to a recent social issue, we can probably find a way to tie it to COVID. So do not discount this program as a potential funding source for you. So finally, what we found was that there were different impacts between communities and the not-for-profits that support them. And I guess that's probably quite obvious, but it's still important to sort of flesh out a little bit. So in the next couple of slides, we're going to try and delineate those impacts a little bit. And we're also going to try and show how you can align them to the Rebuilding Regional Communities program. So first of all, community-wide impacts. So here we've really found three sort of distinct spheres of impact, being social and demographic impacts, health and wellbeing impacts, and economic impacts. So social and demographic impacts might include reduced social engagement and loneliness, homelessness, and changing migration patterns, really having social impacts on communities. Health and wellbeing impacts could include reduced access to primary and tertiary healthcare services, increased demand for services such as mental health services, rehabilitation, and domestic and family violence services. Economic impacts could include reduced tourism and visitor numbers, reduction in migrant workers, as I mentioned before, to key industries and professional services, business closures, supply and labour chain breakdowns, financial stresses at the household level having community-wide impacts. It goes on with the economic impacts. And obviously there was an effect on local food security as well, particularly in isolated towns and particularly when those lockdowns or border closures were happening. In terms of community organisation impacts, again, we've got sort of three themes that came through. One was the financial impacts, one was impacts around volunteerism, and the final one was changing demand and operating conditions for those community organisations. So financial impacts could include pandemic restrictions limiting fundraising opportunities, or perhaps the normal sources of funding like the local businesses which would sponsor these organisations no longer had the capacity to do so. Volunteer burnout through the cumulative stress of droughts, bushfires, COVID and floods is super common. And in some cases, the people that would most often volunteer are still not comfortable returning to the community. So that, of course, affects retired community members. And finally, community organisations have experienced a lot of change in demand and changes in the operating conditions during this period. So in some cases, it's increased demand for services such as food relief or mental health support. Or in other cases, we might be talking about changes in the capacity of the organisation to provide that support. So, for example, through workforce shortages as a result of border closures, or even just a lack of housing in the community can significantly reduce the ability to actually get people providing their time. So you'll see in this slide here, I try and bring it all together in the simplest way possible. So we're talking about the different impacts between communities and community organisations, and then how they aligned to the objectives of the program, which you do need to address in your funding applications. So those community-related objectives really primarily, or community-related impacts, if you're trying to address them in a funding application, then you'd be looking to align them to either the first or the second of our objectives, which are very community focused. Whereas if you're looking at a project that's going to help your community organisation get back on its feet, then you'd be aligning it to our third objective, which is much more community organisation focused. But please note that these categorisations are very broad and they're a guide only, and many of our projects will align to one or more of those objectives. So don't feel you need to focus simply on one of them. So in the next couple of slides, then I'm just going to give you some examples of some nice applications that we've got that sort of flesh out that community impact versus community organisation impact responses, and then we'll just move on to some questions. So the first example we have here is from an organisation called Squid Theatre, and their project was called Saturday Theatre. So Squid Theatre is a community theatre company based in Wynyard in northwest Tasmania. And they found that many people, especially older people and those who are frail, unwell or immunocompromised, were and still are wary of gathering in public indoor venues, which is obviously the primary place that you would go to see theatre. So Squid Theatre responded to these issues by partnering with Coast FM, which is a community-based radio station in Wynyard, who broadcast a weekly radio show called Saturday Radio Theatre. So this was aimed at providing the isolated with a link to their community and a feeling of connection. So Squid sought funding via a microgrant in our first round to expand the format from one-act plays to full-length plays, and to increase the number of local, whether that be Tasmanian or Australian playwrights that they were using. They kept their budget really low, which was really nice, because most of all of the labour was in kind, whether that be through Squid providing their time in kind to do the performance, or through Coast FM providing the venue hire and technician support as well in kind. So that was a really nice example of a great partnership coming together to support isolated community members during this time. And the second example I wanted to show you was an example of addressing organisational impacts during this time. So this was an application we received from Clunes Neighbourhood House in Victoria, and the project was called Rebuilding Capacity Through Volunteering. So it's a bit of a backgrounder. So pre-COVID, Clunes had close to a third of people volunteering, which is absolutely amazing. However, volunteering decreased during the pandemic, which is very much in line with national trends, which actually suggest 1 in 3 people haven't returned to their volunteering roles since the restrictions eased. So in response to this, Clunes Neighbourhood House connected with 9 community groups in the district to map and document the local situation, and to develop a strategy to encourage and promote volunteering in Clunes. The new strategy includes upgrading the hard copy of Volunteer Skills Bank to an online directory, which incorporates every community group in the district, running a campaign to encourage volunteering, and holding quarterly community events to raise awareness and engage existing and new volunteers. So they applied to us for a microgrant to support the implementation of that strategy. And this project shows community-wide partnerships to support multiple community organisations recover from the pandemic. So that was a really nice example of a project that had big impact as well. So just to wrap up how we can help you. So we've got loads of online resources that you can refer to. Obviously, there's the COVID resource, which covers what we've talked about today, that you guys will receive via email. On the FRRR website, we've also got a page dedicated to grant seeker resources, which has loads of videos and tips and tricks that you should hopefully find helpful. So if you refer to the RRC webpage, you'll find a link to the online application, as well as our guidelines and various resources of assistance. You can call during office hours, either myself directly or our 1-800 number, and that will get you through to our amazing grants officers who know much more than I do, I think, anyway. So they're excellent sources of information. Any assistance with project application development or support is available via me. So you've got my contact details up there on the screen at the moment. And you can subscribe to e-news and our socials to stay up to date with information and case studies as well.
Yeah, do jump online and have a look at the impacts of COVID resource, because I found it really helpful to think through all the different angles that relate to impacts of COVID on communities.
Thanks, everyone. Thanks for joining us.